Coming up on today's show, we're going to run through some surprise cut candidates for Denver with the draft firmly in the rearview mirror, free agency more or less behind us. I thought we could look ahead at some potential cut candidates. Now, whenever it's surprise cut candidates, it means it would be a surprise. So before you get all up in arms in the chat of, there's no way this guy gets cut, that's kind of the point of surprise cut candidates. But I know I just gave that spiel, and some people are still going to say I'm crazy for even suggesting this player. But let's start things off with a pair of wide receivers, KJ Hamler and Montrell Washington. No, I am not saying they are going to get cut, but they are definitely surprise candidates. So when we look at Denver's wide receiver room, you have locks like Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, and Marvin Mims. After that, I don't think anything is a guarantee. Now, the battle for the wide receiver 5 and 6 position, I think Callaway and Hamler have the inside track. Sean Payton signed Marquez Callaway, a former New Orleans Saint who played under him in free agency, with the expectation of you're going to be on the 53-man roster, right? He is a bit of a teacher's pet coming in. KJ Hamler, former second-round pick. I want to believe he's going to make the roster, but Montrell Washington's also right there. Kendall Hinton and Jalen Virgil and Brandon Johnson were all on the 53-man roster at some point last season. So if they come in with a good training camp, who's to say they can't make a push for the initial 53-man roster? Now let's start with KJ Hamler, because the story has been injuries, unfortunately, for the former Penn State Nittany Lion. Of course, he comes off a really tough ACL injury and a hip injury and everything to go along with it. Fingers crossed he is back to 100%, because he was not last year, right? Even after the first week when Hackett and the entire medical staff was like, yeah, Hamler can play. And then they're like, Hamler can't play, actually. We got to put him back on the shelf. Now, Montrell Washington is an interesting case because he was only a 5th-round pick a year ago, but it is not looking good for George Payton's Samford Bulldog. The punt returns last year, 8.5 yards, a touch, 32 returns altogether. Not awesome, not horrendous, well, kind of, but not a ton of spark. Now, the kick returns were not good. 18 on average, 18.9 on average, a long of 29. Denver's special teams unit was really bad in 2021, and there was hope that it would be better in 2022 with a new regime in place. No, it definitely took a step back, I thought, last season. No oomph in any element of the game. The return stats altogether for the entire team for the Broncos, 32nd in kickoff, and for punt returns, tied for 21st. So middle of the road-ish, but more so in the back than the front for punt, and just dead last altogether. So you saw last year when Hackett got fired and Rosberg came in there, and what did he do? Immediately made Montrell Washington inactive for the last 2 games of the season, overhauled special teams. Wouldn't be shocked if Sean Payton comes in and continues with the last head coach, or at least the last interim head coach did for Denver. So now I want you all to predict it for me. Will KJ Hamler make the roster? I don't think I can say definitively he will. When you're a 2nd-round pick, you kind of get the benefit of the doubt, and teams want to believe in you. But man, if Brandon Johnson and Jalen Virgil come in after an awesome offseason of working out and they look better than Hamler, I don't think KJ Hamler is going to be firmly a 53-man roster lock. Moving on with some more cut candidates here, let's talk about the center, Lloyd Cushenberry. You knew this one was coming at you, and I don't even know if he's actually a surprise cut candidate. He is definitely a bubble player to make this roster. He did not return for the final 9 games of the 2022 season. Now, PFF ranked him 32 out of 36. There's only 32 teams in the NFL, ladies and gentlemen. So when you are ranked 32nd, like in other words, you're the last ranked starting center in pro football. Now, he carries a $2.9 million cap hit for this season. So if Denver moves on from him, it won't be too much because they're getting a lot of savings. $3 million's nice. $3 million's not a ton, though. It would be, we don't see you as a starting center, so let's just move on altogether, and that way he can maybe get a gig elsewhere. Cushenberry, as of now, is this team's starting center, but they signed Kyle Fuller in the offseason from Seattle, and they really like Alex Forsyth, a rookie out of Oregon, who they picked in round number 7, and is already getting a lot of good buzz out of the gate here. So if Alex Forsyth comes in, has an awesome training camp, and they're like, okay, Forsyth is our starting center. So now the question is, do we want to go with Kyle Fuller as the backup, or do we want to go with Cushenberry as the backup? Don't be shocked if, hey, we think Cush is probably a smidge better, but let's release him. Maybe he can get a starting gig elsewhere, kind of do him a solid, and not have him be a backup this year where everyone just sort of forgets he exists, and Kyle Fuller can be the backup as planned all along. Now, Sean Payton did have an interesting quote a few weeks ago on Lloyd Cushenberry where he said, "We feel like Cushenberry is certainly going to benefit from these additions. We haven't met any of these guys yet, but we see him as our starting center." Now, they see him as their starting center in March, April, or May. I don't know if that's going to carry over to August if Forsyth has a really good camp. So that's why I'm not going to just take Sean Payton's words and go, all right, it's a done deal. Cushenberry, week 1 starting center. Now, before we move on to our next training camp cut candidates, we are in a sub-battle with our Vikings channel. Patrick Seaman, good guy, great guy, but he decided to poke our Broncos channel here, and we've got a good-sized lead on them, but I do not want to see them close the gap before training camp opens up. So help us beat Vikings now here at Chat Sports. Subscribe if you bleed blue and orange. Moving on to our 4th cut candidate. Once again, Mike Purcell. He was a surprise cut candidate last year. He gave me the middle finger, and he made the 53-man roster, and he was a solid rotational defensive tackle for Denver a season ago. I don't believe he is going to start again. I don't quite believe when you look at the depth chart, he has the fit and mold to be an opposite defensive end from Zach Allen. I think he's a prime rotational piece behind DJ Jones, but I don't see him as a starting 5 technique. I just think he's not quite mobile or agile enough. He is entering the last year of his contract, and like I said, he was a solid player for Denver last season. He ranked 42nd out of 127 qualifying interior defensive linemen for PFF. He carries a $3.7 million cap hit, so it's a decent-ish chunk of change. Like, $3.7 million, like, you can do something with that. You're not going to go and sign someone once you cut him in August, right? But if you want to save some money to roll it over to next year and you go, we like Purcell, but I don't know if we like him so much we want to pay him $3.7 million to be a backup nose tackle. Now, last year for Denver, 45 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, and 1.5 sacks. So he is not a bad football player, but I don't know if he's a $3.7 million backup. So if Denver finds like Iyama Wazurike, right, who has a great training camp this year in his second season, maybe they feel more comfortable about him as their backup and for much less costs. Let's get on to our final cut candidate, Albert Okwuegbunam. It's a bummer because I was decently high on Albert O going into last season, right? It was, hey, you just traded away Noah Fant. Maybe Albert O can step into a larger role. He's had some good moments so far, but now I think he's on the outside looking in. When I look at Denver's tight end room, Greg Dulcich, lock, that's your tight end 1. Chris Mannertz, he's going to be your blocking tight end. They added him early in free agency. You traded for Adam Trautman during the draft. I feel like those 3 guys are pretty firmly in the mix to make the 53-man roster. So then there's Albert O on the outside looking in. Last year for Denver, he was largely a non-factor, right? After a couple of games, Denver decided to go with Eric Saubert. Hackett had him as a healthy scratch for a long stretch. It wasn't until Hackett got fired that Albert O saw a role in the offense once again, but just 10 grabs, 95 yards, and 1 touchdown. Now, I think Albert O could be a training camp trade candidate. Remember Trinity Benson, 2021? When it was a second training camp and he got traded to Detroit. The Lions did not have any good receivers. Maybe if another team's tight end gets hurt in the preseason, they give Denver a call and go, hey, you know you're kind of good at tight end. Can we take Albert O off your hands for a future 7th-round pick? So kind of keep that in the back of your mind throughout training camp. Now, I just ran through 5 surprise cut candidates. Give me yours, right? Give me someone that maybe people are being a bit too confident on or a bit too sure of that guy making the roster. And you're like, hey, I think he's got a chance of making a good chance, but I don't think he's a lock, right? That's sort of the whole thing of surprise cut candidates, of they're not locks to make the roster. So let me know who yours is down in the comment section. That's going to do it for us on today's edition of the Broncos Breakdown. Thank you so much for tuning in, hanging out with us. I will sign off and see everyone later.